A brand new banner with brand new characters that bring brand new skills and another arcane. Do you want this arcane for your specific dragons? Most likely. Here's why. Arcane Fellstone. It is a slaying dragonstone that grants spectrum stats based on 25% of the foe's attack for a maximum of 14. It has first hit damage reduction for 40%, including against brave attacks. It grants special cooldown charge +1 per attack, and if you're fast enough, you get no follow-up out of it. It's essentially what a lot of other people would deem the speedy variant of the next arcane, similarly to how we got Devourer for swords and Threma for axes. And just like those two weapons, I would argue this is a much better upgrade comparatively to what they had prior. Although I can't really say there was much home to write about when it came to Arcane Grima. It was a slaying dragonstone that granted Spectrum 5, a guaranteed follow-up. It did have true damage based on your own attack, which did work with AoEs, and it restored HP after combat. Really, the only notable thing out of this was the fact that it had true damage. But beyond that aspect, it just happened to be the best most dragons could really work with, unless you were using Surprise Breath, but that was a whole different thing on its own. We were eventually able to get more generic options for dragons, mostly in the form of the recent New Year weapons that grant true damage reduction, and really just kind of put Arcane Grima out of a job for the most part. And for the dragons that were still straggling with Arcane Grima, Arcane Fellstone is here to put the final nail in that coffin. I find that unless you have a PRF that's worth keeping, or a PRF skill that you don't really want to swap out for any arcane, you definitely just want to run Fellstone. There's only one scenario where I would absolutely recommend Arcane Grima, and it's not exactly the most self-sufficient thing anyway. I would only ever recommend it on your generic dragon calves because of their high mobility and the true damage that you get out of Arcane Grima. And even then, it's only going to be applicable to any sort of AoE strategy, which isn't exactly the easiest thing to do on your own. If you really just wanted to be self-sufficient anyway, you could still go with Arcane Fellstone. And at this point, I don't think there's really any sort of dragon that wants to use Arcane Grima at all. The only units that you probably want to wait on giving out anything in particular are the ones that are going to be getting refines relatively soon. If IS continues the trend of refining CYO units really early, then Tiki should get hers within a few months, and Halloween Tiki and Grima should be near the end of Book 4 refines, but they do follow a different schedule comparatively since they are seasonals, but it shouldn't be all that far out. But as far as the rest of the units are concerned, yeah, you probably just want to run the new arcane. Even as far as generic inheritables are concerned, they at times will just end up being better than Arcane Grima. And you obviously have stuff like Dragon Sun Plus and New Sunstone, which have true damage reduction built into it. The former has null follow-up based on speed, and the latter has built-in guard. You could pair this up with stuff like Lagoo's Friend or Hardy Fighter or whatever decent B slot that will accompany the weapon itself. Infantry have the benefit of stacking it up to high Oblivion, especially if they have a really good defense and speed stat. The ones that just only have the attack set to go off of, it's still 35% at the end of the day, which can be really good on specific units. You also have Surprise Breath, which is a really good debuffing weapon in general. It gives you attack res +5 statically, but then it will automatically debuff the foe by 20% of your own res at the start of combat for a high amount of attack and res. The only caveat is that this mostly applied to infantry and armor specifically. Flying and cavalry dragons have always been in this weird position where they lack notable skills and niches that other units that have better weapon types do better. Offensively, dragon flyers aren't going to be nearly as good as any sort of sword, lance, axe flyer. Same thing on the cavalry side too, since they also have access to the likes of No Quarter. And on the defensive side, they don't have access to anything like Guard Bearing 4 or Wyvern Rift 4. The best they really have to work with in terms of defensive B slots is Dragon Wall, and that's not exactly the best B slot nowadays. Cabs aren't really known for tanking anyway, so I'll at least give dragons that. But really the point of this is that it's going to be following a similar suit for a lot of flyers and cavalry in general, because even though this arcane does have a very decent amount of effects, for a lot of archetypes it feels more of just the best available option now, and less because of the fact that it will make them really good, and more just that it is the best thing that they could potentially do. But this is also part of the reason why I want to bring up these breaths too, because they are inherently competitive in their own right. Even if they aren't necessarily as loaded with effects, True damage reduction and debuffing a lot of attack and res is inherently good for tanking, period. But Arcane Fellstone, it's a one and done deal. It has null follow-up for a lot of faster units, breath, DR, a lot of stats and slaying. You'll get a fair amount of mileage out of it for the most part, but if it is something you are worried about giving out or just summoning for, you do have other available options, which is why I wanted to bring them up. And Arcane Grima bad. Anyway, let's go to builds. Let's start with the most diverse options, aka your infantry. Arcane Fellstone already has null follow-up built into it. It has breath. It has a bunch of stats, slaying, and DR, so it's already removing a decent amount of B slots and Sacred Seal options from the pool. But because they are infantry, they already have a lot more options they can take advantage of. One of the most prominent ones definitely being Lagoo's Friend. This is something that I think a lot of people are going to have to take into account. Dragon's Roar is an offensive special, even though it has defensive properties, so Lagoo's Friend will require that you do not have it on an arcane because of the innate slaying. If you were to use Arcane Fellstone with Lagoo's Friend, it just will not work, and it won't give you any of the notable effects because it counts as a 2 cooldown special. That being said, Aether is still completely on the table if you want to use that. Arcane Fellstone with breath and slaying makes it a 4 cooldown special. Once you get hit, it is 2 cooldown, and because Lagoo's Friend gives you 2 quick impulses, then you'll be able to retaliate with an instant Aether. It's not the only option, of course, but it's probably the best thing you can do if you're going to be running Lagoo's Friend with Arcane Fellstone, partially just because of the fact that you get sustainability out of it. But even outside of Lagoo's Friend, you have stuff like Bulwark, tier 4 tempos if you are still worried about getting shred in some capacity, or you can run Counter Roar, which is a really decent combination with Arcane Fellstone because of the Brave Hit damage reduction built into it. You could also run stuff such as Scowl, and depending on how much you want to invest into it, you could run Guard Echo, so that way you could just completely shut off specials with the likes of Guard Echo and Tempo. But given that it is an incredibly expensive Echo slot, you could still run Boost, but you won't have the ability to get any sort of Scowl effects, which means you are a bit more prone to instant specials, which can be a bit of an issue if they are already pre-charged. Even so, having guards somewhere in your kit with the likes of tier 4 tempos is already a really good combination on its own. You can run finish skills for easier sustainability, bonus doubler, distant counter, bonus doubler, depending on whether or not the dragon you're using has good amount of res. They could use ploys. Fatal Smoke with the likes of Lagoo's Friend or Counter Roar can easily secure a lot more one-shots if you are able to deal enough damage. And other than that, you could continually stack up stats with the likes of Squad Ace Seals, preferably the ones that come after BS because it gives you HP +5 and +3 to 2 respective stats, bonus doubler, oaths, and drives. Anything that doesn't necessarily overlap but still gives you a decent amount of benefits out of it, you could easily run on an infantry unit. Meanwhile, with the armor units, they're still going to be playing by the rules of Hardy Fighter because it is still arguably one of their best B slots even to this day. Arcane Fellstone is still a really good enabler of it and gives a bunch of stats and effects that can make their job a whole lot easier. Mostly the Spectrum 14 and the breath effect itself. Not having to outsource any sort of acceleration is a big boon for Hardy Fighter looping, especially if you are looking to charge up stuff like Miracle. Miracle with Hardy Fighter already starts at a 2 cooldown, so every second hit could easily be a Miracle proc, assuming the foe doesn't have any sort of guard or tempo effects. Otherwise, it's the same deal as usual with armors. You run stuff like Hardy Fighter or Beacon and Flow with Candy Fighter or Counter Roar if you really want to run that. I would argue Candy Fighter is definitely going to be a lot better here, but you do get damage reflection out of Counter Roar itself. You still have stuff like Scowls and tier 4 boosts that can make tanking a whole lot easier. The Spectrum 14 can't really go understated. It is a lot of stats that you just get out of the Arcane and can make the ability to eat hits so much easier. And again, because you're getting acceleration, you don't necessarily need to give up your Sacred Seal for a Breath Seal, nor do you necessarily need to run a B slot that gives acceleration through a fighter. You can essentially min-max your options a lot more. Your A slot options by and far are going to be the only flexible thing here. Hardy Fighter, Candy Fighter, Counter Roar, very limited. Saves, even more limited. Your Sacred Seals are most likely just going to be stat boosters, but if you are going to be acting as a far save, you could also run the Distant Counter Seal. Specials, if you either want to go with something damaging or something that loops with Hardy Fighter, there you go. skill, but your A slots could either be something like Scout, Tier 4 Boost, Unity, or even Close Defense and Distant Defense, because having the ability to also neutralize bonuses is a really good effect. And then we get to the Dragon Flyers, and I find that this is probably going to be the most limited thing here, at least through the lens of Arcane Fellstone. You're pretty much just going to be running a lot of enemy phase stuff for the most part, although the player phase options are available just because of their archetype. Even so, enemy phasing is probably going to be the most preferred thing here, because a lot of the effects that they do have, even as a flyer, are very enemy phase or ally adjacent, so naturally you're just going to be sitting in place a lot of the time, even if it just means you're giving out support through Rain Snap or guidance skills or even Crux. You could at least sit there and deal damage if you need to do that in the enemy phase with the likes of Counter Roar, or if you want to stack up even more damage reduction, you could go with Dragon Wall, although I imagine the percentage isn't going to be nearly as high since you're already getting a lot of damage reduction from the weapon. This can still apply on the follow-up hits since the Arcane only works on the first attacks, not anything that comes after. So if you don't necessarily kill, you still have the ability to shrug off damage if necessary. You also have the ability to run Scowl, so you can shut off specials if necessary, and if you could outsource Guard or put it in your kit somewhere, Scowl and Guard is just a really nice combo to have all around. And otherwise, you still have the same tried and true A slots of Boost, Unity, and Catch. Your Sacred Seals are also just going to be a bunch of stat boosters, but really anything that allows you to trigger specials such as Dragon Roar, Miracle, Aether, or if you are worried about getting hit by Guard itself, you can run lower cooldown specials such as Luna, Moonbow, Bonfire, whatever is respective to the individual set of the user, just so that you can guarantee getting special damage out. But as far as their options are concerned with builds when it comes to using Arcane Fellstone, it's definitely going to be a lot more limited comparatively to armors and infantry. Even though the former is very set in what they do as a archetype, it's still something that they have the flexibility of going around with, and it does work very well. And lastly, you just have the Cavalry, and they're pretty much in a similar situation, except there's also an argument to using Arcane Grima specifically on them. This is something that could have also applied to the Flyers since they also have access to Snap, but I find that having the innate movement is such a bigger boon and is so much easier to just not get shut off in the process that I didn't necessarily feel confident in recommending it on Flyers specifically. Even so, if you did want to use Arcane Fellstone on any of the Cavalry Dragons that we have, which I'm pretty sure is like 4 at most, you could still do the same thing of enemy phasing with Counter Roar, using Dragon's Roar so that you could retaliate with a really hard-hitting special. You could stack it up with the likes of Dragon's Wrath Sacred Seal if you want to hit even harder. Squads and catches are always good for stat boosting. I would definitely say their A slot options are more limited, but if they are going to be enemy phasing anyway, they could easily just use the same stuff that a lot of the Flyers are using. Although I do think if you are going to be using any sort of Cav Dragon with an Arcane, I definitely think Arcane Grima is the best option here, even though you could still use Arcane Fellstone for player phase tools, especially if you are fast. I definitely value the ability to run AoEs with true damage, and because they are melee Cavs, they could also run away with the likes of Near Trace or Alarms or anything that allows them to just get in and out of combat and back to safety. Arcane Grima is probably going to be the best job for that. True damage in the weapon for 15% of the attack, and with the recent addition of Crystalline Water and Verge of Death, you're getting a lot more visibles in order to do way more damage for AoEs, on top of the fact that you don't get the panic status, which is really good specifically for AoE strategies. There's definitely a niche here. The only big catch is that charging up an AoE is going to be difficult, and if you have to loop it, it's not really going to be something that's a lot more feasible unless you run external support, but you're already going to be running external support for the AoE as is. The amount of damage that you could potentially do with Arcane Grima and an AoE is going to far exceed a lot of their other options. And as far as Arcane Fellstone recommendation and builds are concerned, this is probably going to be about it. I figured we were going to be due for another Dragonstone eventually because Arcane Grima was outdated for a very long time, and I'd hardly say I'm surprised with the one we just got. It is a really decent upgrade, and it's one that I think most units will definitely appreciate, especially over the original Arcane. And even for the dragons that don't necessarily have a lot of speed, I find that just having the null follow-up only be tied to speed is what makes it so much more flexible. And if you do end up polling for this and you want to give it out to your favorite dragon, let me know who you're going to give it to down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.